The sun hung low over the distant horizon, painting the sky in golden hues as smoke from evening fires curled gently from the chimneys of stone cottages scattered across the emerald hills. Life in the sleepy village of Eldermore moved at its own rhythm, humble, honest, and untouched by the stirrings of the outside world. Among its quiet inhabitants was Thorne, a peasant known not for riches nor reputation, but for his integrity and the deep connection he shared with the land he tilled. On that particular evening, as the crickets began their chorus and the world prepared for rest, Thorne was returning from the forest with a bundle of wild herbs slung over his back. The woods, dense and often whispered about, were as familiar to him as his own breath. He moved with quiet precision, guided not just by instinct, but by respect for the earth beneath his boots. He was nearing the edge of the trees when a sharp cry fractured the peaceful hum of twilight. A woman's scream. He dropped his bundle and sprinted through the undergrowth, thorns tearing at his arms as he charged toward the sound. It took only moments before he found her, collapsed against the roots of an ancient ash tree, clutching her leg with pale, trembling fingers. Her eyes were wide with panic, her breath shallow. A few feet away, a coiled viper slithered into the leaves, its venom already delivered. Without hesitation, Thorne knelt beside her. "You've been bitten," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Hold on." She nodded faintly, her face contorting in pain. He drew a blade from his belt, made a quick incision near the wound, and began to extract the venom the way his grandmother once taught him, carefully, deliberately. Then he pulled a pouch from his belt, sprinkled powdered roots over the bite, and bound the leg with strips torn from his own shirt. Only when he was sure she wouldn't lose the leg did he finally look into her face, really look. She wasn't from the village. That much was certain. Her clothing was travel-worn, but finely stitched. Her skin, though now pale, carried the glow of someone unaccustomed to hardship. Around her neck, beneath the tangled fall of her dark hair, a medallion shimmered faintly in the dying light. Not of common silver or brass, but gold. Imprinted with a sigil he vaguely remembered seeing once, long ago, in a tattered history book, a lion entwined with ivy. "Who are you?" he asked, handing her a flask of water. Her lips were cracked but composed. "My name is Elira." It was all she offered, and for now he didn't press. He carried her gently through the woods, back toward his cottage, where he placed her on the straw bed and lit a fire. Over the next few days, as her strength returned, so too did fragments of her story. She was no common traveler. She was the daughter of King Edric of Valmir, a land whispered about like legend, far beyond the mountains. The kingdom, lost to civil war, had scattered its royalty to protect the bloodline. Elira had lived in exile for most of her life under a false name, her identity hidden even from herself, until recently, when a dying priest revealed her lineage and gave her the medallion that proved her claim. She had been journeying to Valmir's old capital to uncover what remained of her past, when the snake struck. Thorne listened each night as she spoke by firelight, the flames casting shadows on the timbered walls. Her voice, though refined, carried sorrow, the weight of a crown she never sought and a destiny etched in blood. One evening, as he prepared soup from carrots and barley, she said quietly, "Why did you help me?" He looked up. "Because you were dying, and because no one else would have reached you in time." She stared at him for a long moment, then smiled, not the courtly kind, but one born of gratitude too deep for words. Days turned to weeks. Her strength returned. She walked again, first with a cane, then on her own. But something had shifted between them, an unspoken understanding that needed no name. Thorne had begun to see in her not just a royal heir, but a woman whose soul still bore scars. And Elira, in turn, saw in him a man who asked for nothing, yet gave everything. But fate, as always, stirred restlessly in the wings. One night, riders arrived at the edge of Eldermore. Cloaked in steel and shadow, they dismounted without words, bearing banners emblazoned with the sigil of Valmir. They called for Elira by name. Word had reached the remaining loyalists. Elira was alive. Her claim, though uncertain, could rally a fractured kingdom. She stood before them, the firelight flickering behind her, and nodded. "I will come," she said. "But I do not come alone." The soldiers looked puzzled until she stepped aside, revealing Thorne, his tunic plain, his hands still rough with soil, but his eyes steady. He said nothing, only stood beside her, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "You mean to bring a peasant?" one night sneered. She met the man's gaze with steel in her own. "He is the reason I am alive. He is more loyal than any noble I've ever known. If I am to reclaim Valmir, it will be with those I trust. Or not at all. A silence stretched between them before the leader of the riders finally gave a respectful nod. As you wish, my lady. As the moon climbed high over Eldermore, Thorne packed little. Only the pouch of herbs, a worn knife, and the locket his mother once gave him. He turned to look at the fields one last time, the soil he had called home. Then he mounted the horse they offered him and rode beside Elira into the night, toward a kingdom on the edge of chaos, toward a destiny neither of them had asked for. Yet both were now bound to fulfill. The journey across the borderlands was fraught with both wonder and peril. As the procession moved further from the familiarity of Eldermore, the land began to shift. Rolling hills gave way to jagged cliffs, dense forests thickened with silence, and the air grew heavier with stories whispered by the wind. Thorne rode in quiet observation, ever watchful, his senses sharpened by instinct. Though the knights barely acknowledged him at first, they had started grudgingly to respect his calm, unwavering presence. He was not one of them, but he was clearly more than they had expected. Elira rode at the front, her posture upright, regal despite the simplicity of her attire. The medallion she now wore openly across her chest seemed to emit a quiet authority. But only Thorne knew how often her fingers reached for it in the dark, gripping it not like a badge of power, but like a lifeline. Each time she looked over her shoulder to find him there, something softened in her gaze. Unspoken trust deepened with every mile they rode together. They stopped at abandoned outposts, ancient watchtowers that once belonged to Volmir's army. The people who remained in those lands, woodcutters, traders, and fugitives, recognized the emblem Elira bore. They knelt, wept, begged for hope. Stories spilled from their lips, of lords who sold their souls to foreign kings, of villages burned, of children taken for coin. Elira listened to each tale, not as a queen might, but as someone who carried their grief on her own shoulders. One evening, as they made camp near a river under a sky scattered with stars, Elira sat beside Thorne. The fire crackled between them, its warmth a fragile barrier against the chill. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a worn parchment, part of a letter, its ink smudged with age. "It was from my mother," she said softly, passing it to him. "She wrote it before she was taken from the castle. I never knew she existed until 2 months ago." Thorne unfolded it carefully. The script was elegant, though fading. In the letter, her mother spoke not of courts or crowns, but of love, how she had dreamed of raising her daughter free from politics, from the burden of a broken throne. She had hidden Elira away not to abandon her, but to protect her. "She wanted me to live a quiet life," Elira whispered. "But the world wouldn't allow it." Thorne returned the letter. "Maybe that quiet life still waits for you," he said. "But only after you've fought to earn it." She smiled faintly, then looked toward the water where the moonlight danced. "And what about you, Thorne? What do you want after all this is over?" He poked the fire thoughtfully. "Peace. Maybe a bit of land where nothing follows me, but seasons. I never imagined I'd be riding with knights, walking beside royalty." "You're not walking beside royalty," she said firmly. "You're walking beside me." In that moment, something shifted between them again. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was undeniable. A current of something deeper than gratitude, more fragile than love, yet just as powerful. A week later, they arrived at the outskirts of Heir, the fallen capital of Volmir. It was a city half swallowed by time, its towers blackened by fire, its stone walls still bearing scars of a decade-old siege. But flags of resistance fluttered from hidden windows. As the company approached, they were met not with hostility but silent awe. News had traveled faster than they had imagined. The lost heir had returned. They entered the citadel through the ruins of the West Gate. Loyalists, those who had waited in secret for a symbol, a sign, emerged from the shadows. Among them were aged knights, scribes, and once powerful nobles stripped of title but not of will. Elira dismounted and walked among them, not with arrogance, but with open arms. She didn't ask for oaths. She listened. Inside the crumbled great hall, she addressed them all, not from a throne, but standing in the center of the circle. "I come not to reclaim a crown soaked in blood," she said, "but to restore what was broken. I do not rule because I was born to it. I lead because I cannot turn my back on those who still believe Volmir can be whole again." The hall erupted with cries of allegiance. For the first time in years, the banner of Volmir was raised not in defiance, but in unity. Thorne, watching from a corner, felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. Pride, yes, but something else too. A distance forming between the girl he had once carried through the forest and the woman now forging a nation. He didn't belong in this world of councils and decrees, where power flowed in every glance. He was still the man with dirt under his nails and a knife in his boot. And though no one said it, he could feel eyes measuring him. Even loyalty had its limits in the face of legacy. That night, Elira found him alone in the old library, where ivy grew through shattered windows and books lay strewn like fallen soldiers. He stood before a mural of the former kings, proud, rigid, cold-eyed. "I'm not like them," she said behind him. He didn't turn. "You don't have to convince me." She stepped closer. "Then why do you look like you're already preparing to leave?" "Because I know how this story goes," he said quietly. "You were born of gold. I was born of dust." She took his hand, her fingers trembling. "I was born of a mother who fled in the night, and a kingdom torn by greed. I was raised in shadows. If I am gold now, it's because I bled for it. And you are the only constant in this entire storm." Thorne met her gaze. For the first time, he saw her not just as the woman he had saved, but as the one who had saved him in return. She leaned closer, her voice a breath. "Stay with me, Thorne. Not because I need you to fight, but because I cannot imagine crossing the next threshold without you." The silence stretched, filled with the quiet rustle of pages and the wind through broken stone. Then finally he nodded. And outside, far beneath the fractured towers of Heir, a new fire began to burn, one that neither war nor time could easily extinguish. Months passed. Heir transformed from a ruin to a heartbeat. Roads that once led to nowhere now pulsed with traders, healers, blacksmiths, and hopeful travelers. The forgotten kingdom stirred, called back to life by whispers and memory, and a woman who refused to be just a symbol. Elira did not rebuild with crowns and commands. She rebuilt with trust. Her council met beneath open skies. Her soldiers bowed not out of fear, but loyalty earned. Where once corruption nested in every corner, honesty now flickered like lanterns in the dark. She had not just returned to claim a title, she had returned to restore dignity. And by her side, always just a step away from the shadows, stood Thorne. No longer seen as an outsider, but as the silent fire behind her will. They called him the Warden of the Fields, a title he laughed at when he first heard it. But he wore it, not as armor, but as memory. He never exchanged his worn boots for polished shoes, never replaced his farmer's belt with jeweled sashes. While the nobility adorned themselves for court, Thorne still rose at dawn and walked through the gardens he planted himself within the castle walls. Herbs, roots, flowers native to the forgotten corners of Valmir. He said it kept him grounded. She knew it kept him whole. Together, they stood not as queen and consort, but as something the people had never seen before. Leaders who had no hunger for power, only for purpose. But peace never lingers long in a land once scarred by war. In the north, a rival noble, Dareth Velen, once a cousin of the fallen king, had declared Elira a false heir, a pretender born of rebellion and myth. He amassed forces beyond the frost-covered mountains, drawing alliances with foreign lords who feared the rise of a ruler beloved by her people. His campaign was brutal. Villages razed in the night, emissaries vanished without a trace, spies slipped into Valmir like smoke under doors. Elira met each threat with unwavering resolve, yet something in her spirit weighed heavier with each report. One winter morning, Thorne found her in the war chamber, hands pressed to the edge of a stone map, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. "They fear you because you remind them what true power looks like," he said gently. She didn't look up. "I don't want to become what I'm fighting." "You won't," he said, moving beside her, "because you never forgot who you are, even when the world begged you to change." She turned to him then, searching his face, not for answers but for anchor. And she found it, as she always had. In his silence. In his steadiness. In the man who had once carried her from the woods, not knowing who she was, and choosing to save her anyway. It was then she made a choice that stunned even her own generals. She would ride north, not with an army, but with 5 men. One of them was Thorne. Not to fight, but to speak. She carried not a sword, but a sealed pact, written by her own hand, a declaration of unity, signed by every lord of Valmir who now stood with her. They reached Dareth's camp under a banner of truce. The air was sharp, the tension thicker than snow-laden branches. Dareth expected submission. What he found was something far more dangerous, a woman unafraid of death, and a man at her side who radiated more strength than any soldier. She stood before the noble who had sent assassins in the night and set fire to homes of innocent families. She offered not vengeance, but a final chance at reconciliation. "I am not here to kneel," she said. "I am here to end the cycle that took our fathers, poisoned our brothers, and buried our children. Volmir deserves better than blood on its soil and pride in its grave." Dareth scoffed. "And what if I refuse your peace?" Thorne stepped forward, his eyes steady. "Then you'll answer to all of Volmir. Not with war, but with the weight of your own people turning against you." The silence that followed was suffocating. And then a whisper of movement. One by one, Dareth's commanders lowered their banners. It was not Elira's threat that changed the course of history. It was the truth in her voice, and the presence of a man beside her who was not noble by blood, but by heart. A peasant, once mocked, now stood taller than princes. Dareth had no choice. He withdrew. His ambition collapsed under the weight of his isolation. And so peace returned, not by sword but by conviction. Years passed. The kingdom flourished. Elira never wore a crown. She said Volmir had too many of those in the past. Instead, she wore the same medallion Thorne found glinting beneath her hair that day in the forest. A symbol not of royalty, but of rebirth. They never married in a grand ceremony. There were no golden arches or foreign dignitaries or feasts that lasted days. Instead, they stood together beneath the ash tree where he had first saved her. Just the two of them. A single vow spoken not in ceremony, but in silence. He kissed her hand. She kissed his soil-stained fingers. That was enough. The people called her the sovereign without a throne. They called him the farmer king. But to each other, they were simply Elira and Thorne. They walked the gardens every morning, sometimes hand in hand, sometimes just in step. Their children grew up knowing both how to read ancient scrolls and how to plant potatoes. The castle was never cold again, not because of fires, but because of laughter. Bards sang of their story not as a fairy tale, but as a testament. That greatness is not born from lineage, but from choice. That sometimes a kingdom's future begins not in royal chambers, but in the quiet fields of a humble man who chose to save a stranger without knowing she would one day change the world. And so, long after their names were etched into stone and whispered into the wind, the tale of Thorne and Elira endured, not for the war they ended or the land they ruled, but for the love they lived, the peace they protected, and the reminder that no soul is ever too small to shape the destiny of a nation.